You telling me we actually have to check this thing every hour? Looks good from afar, brother.
Man, it's already heating up.
Yeah, tell me about it. I can't wait to get this gear off.
August 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The air is already turning. Summer heat still clings to the wooden barracks after noon, but the shadows are long and sharp, and a cooler wind moves across the parade ground like a quiet warning of the winter to come. Barbed wire hums faintly when it catches the breeze. Somewhere beyond the fence line, pine and scrub and open training land stretch toward the horizon, indifferent to who is inside and who is outside. A mess hall door swings open. Metal trays clatter. Boots scrape gravel. And then briefly, unexpectedly, there is laughter. It is not a cheer, not a taunt, not the crude laughter of a mob. It is a quick sound between two Americans, ordinary and unguarded, the kind of sound that belongs to cafeterias and street corners and baseball bleachers. It was the sound of a country that still remembers what it feels like to be unafraid. On the other side of the fence, a line of Japanese prisoners stands with their heads angled slightly downward, eyes trained to observe without seeming to observe. Among them are women few enough that records rarely linger on them, present enough to be remembered as silhouettes within a much larger machine. Their hair is pinned tight. Their hands are kept close. Their posture carries the discipline of a world where shame is a weapon and surrender is a stain. They hear the laughter and do not understand it, not because they cannot recognize humor, but because they cannot place it inside the rules they were taught were permanent. They have lived through a war where the enemy was supposed to be monstrous, and where their own nation's insistence on honor had turned even hunger into a moral instruction. They have been told again and again that capture meant humiliation. That the enemy would not only kill your body but would dismantle your dignity and keep the pieces as trophies. They have been told that Americans were rich but weak, powerful but undisciplined, and that this softness was the seam that would tear when Japan held out long enough. But now they stand in an American POW camp in the continental United States, and they hear guards laughing near a clipboard. For them, it is like hearing thunder on a clear day. This moment matters because it reveals what the war looked like away from the front lines, where violence was not measured in artillery rounds, but in routines, food served on time, medical inspections, wages issued, letters censored, schedules posted, rules followed. In those quiet places, the war continued as a contest between systems. Every prisoner became a forced observer. Every day became a comparison test. And in that test, laughter becomes evidence. The Pacific War was one of the most brutal theaters of World War II. A war fought in jungles and atolls, on black sand and coral reefs, where death could come from bullets, malaria, starvation, or the sea itself. It was also a war with an unusually hard edge around surrender. Japanese military culture, shaped by imperial ideology and a severe code of obedience, treated capture as disgrace. Soldiers were conditioned to avoid it at almost any cost. That conditioning did not remain confined to men in uniform. It spread through the entire wartime society, carried by newspapers, school lessons, official speeches, and the tightening grip of the state as defeat approached. For Japanese women attached to the war effort, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, factory workers, and civilian employees absorbed into military spaces, the message was the same: endure, obey, do not shame the nation. If capture came, it would be a darkness from which there was no clean return. In many parts of the Pacific, the fear of captivity was reinforced by the reality of war itself. People saw how prisoners were treated when power shifted violently. People heard stories of violence, of reprisals, of the way war stripped away restraint. And on the American side, U.S. Dawn, troops had their own reasons to imagine Japanese captivity as something different from the European experience. They knew or quickly learned what Allied prisoners had endured under Japanese control in the Philippines, in Burma, in Thailand, and Japan itself. They had seen bodies reduced by starvation, and they had heard accounts of beatings, forced labor, and disease. This knowledge hardened American anger and made mercy feel unnatural to some. So when Japanese prisoners entered American hands, many expected vengeance. Yet the United States, operating within its own military legal framework and its public commitment to international norms, built an enormous system for handling enemy prisoners. It was a system that held hundreds of thousands of Axis captives overall, and within that system there were camps that held Japanese prisoners as well, comparatively fewer than the Germans, but not negligible. By the end of the war, the number of Japanese prisoners captured by Western allies and held in their camps was tens of thousands. Even one common reference figure places Japanese POWs in Western Allied captivity at the end of the war in the range of roughly 40,000. The numbers matter because they show scale. This was not an improvised arrangement. It was an industrial process of captivity. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin became one of the best documented examples of that process. A U.S. Army historical summary of research into Camp McCoy's World War II POW camp states that the camp held German, Polish, and Italian service personnel. It was the largest Japanese POW camp in the United States during the war, with nearly 3,000 Japanese prisoners at its height. It also emphasizes that the study covers camp life in detail, security and guarding procedures, medicine, paid work, and recreation during off hours. A later Fort McCoy history article states that the POW and internment facility relocated 293 enemy alien internees, including Japanese, and that the camp was the largest holding facility for Japanese POWs in the continental United States, with 2,700 Japanese POWs, also housing nearly 3,000 German and 500 Korean POWs until POW operations ceased in 1946. Those numbers are not just statistics. They are the size of the fence, the length of the mess line, the number of beds in a barracks, the number of eyes watching the guards. And here in this story, the focus narrows to a handful of Japanese women present in the margins of the system, yet shaped by it. We must be careful and honest. The archival record is much thinner for Japanese women POWs in the continental US than for German POWs, and some women in custody were not POWs but enemy alien detainees or other categories. Even at Honolulu in Hawaii, the National Park Service notes that at least 10 women were held there and that records about their daily lives are limited. But we can still tell the story truthfully because the historical reality is larger than any one roster. The reality is that Japan's war produced prisoners, some military, some civilian, some women who found themselves under American control, and that American custody operated in a way that often contradicted what Japanese wartime ideology had predicted. That contradiction is the engine of this narration. The Japanese women in this story arrive in captivity, carrying a map of the world drawn by propaganda and fear. The map says, Americans are brutal, decadent, undisciplined, and racially chaotic. They will humiliate you. They will take pleasure in your suffering. They will use you as proof of Japan's defeat. The map also says, surrender is shame. Captivity is contamination. Survival itself becomes morally complicated. Now the women are inside a fenced compound in Wisconsin. They see the towers. They see the wire. They see the armed guards. Those parts fit the map. Prison is prison. But then they notice the other parts that do not fit. They notice that the camp has an internal order that does not seem improvised. They notice that the guards follow routines. They notice that there are posted schedules and assigned work details. They notice that there is medical attention even if it is basic and sometimes indifferent. They notice that prisoners are counted, not hunted. That food is served regularly, not used as a weapon of arbitrary control. They notice that boredom exists, an unromantic, quiet form of mercy. Boredom means you expect tomorrow to happen, and then they hear the laughter. In the Japanese wartime worldview, authority did not laugh with subordinates. Authority was something you feared. It spoke in commands. It demanded stillness. It did not display ease because ease was weakness, and weakness was disgrace. In the American camp, authority is expressed differently. It is expressed in paperwork, in routine, in the idea that a soldier can enforce captivity and still remain in some moments a person. That is why laughter is so powerful as a symbol. It is not the laughter of a winner mocking the defeated. It is the laughter of someone who believes the world is stable enough to permit humor. In that belief is a kind of abundance, not abundance of food alone, abundance of confidence, abundance of institutional stability. The Japanese women do not understand it at first. Their bodies are trained to interpret any warmth from the enemy as a trap, any looseness as danger. In wartime, gentleness can be an invitation to betrayal. They have watched their society police itself through suspicion. They have seen how a wrong expression can become evidence of disloyalty. They have learned that survival requires control of the face, of the voice, of the eyes. So when they hear Americans laughing, they do not relax. They freeze. The first days in a camp like Camp McCoy are a catalog of humiliations that are not intended as humiliation, but feel like it anyway. Being counted brewing, being eschewed clothing, being assigned a bunk, being told when to eat, being inspected. The body becomes an object in someone else's system. Yet even here, the difference between systems is visible. In one system, the body is controlled to break it. In another, the body is controlled to manage it. The women begin to see that the American camp is a machine of management. Camp McCoy's history, as summarized in the Army's article, describes how quickly the installation altered facilities to house prisoners and how it expanded to accommodate thousands. It emphasizes that a major recent study covers the camp's layout, buildings, and the daily life of prisoners and internees, including work, pay, guarding procedures, and recreation. This is important because it means captivity was not simply guards and wire. It was infrastructure, it was logistics. It was an administrative worldview. A country able to create such a system is not a country on the verge of collapse. Japanese propaganda had promised that America's softness would break. The camp's existence is a direct contradiction. Even the physical photographs from Camp McCoy barracks, guard towers, the standardized geometry of the POW area carry this contradiction as a visual fact. They show a place that looks like a town built in a hurry, but still built to function. Image. For Japanese women prisoners, the contrast becomes more painful because of what they remember of home. By 1945, Japan's home front was being pounded from the air. Cities were burning. Food was scarce. The language of sacrifice had become a kind of solvent that dissolved everything else. Private doubt, comfort, even laughter. Laughter in a society under total war can begin to feel like a betrayal of those who are dying. It can feel like an indulgence, a moral weakness. So when these women hear American guards laughing near a mess hall, it is not only a cultural shock, it is a reminder that America is not living in the same state of desperation. That difference is the invisible half of the barbed wire. And so the women begin to ask questions they do not speak aloud. They begin to watch more carefully. They begin to interpret small details as clues to the real strength of the enemy. They stop thinking only in terms of cruelty and begin to think in terms of capacity. Capacity to build camps, capacity to feed prisoners, capacity to keep rules, capacity to have men whose laughter is not forbidden by fear. This is the beginning of transformation, not admiration, but the collapse of certainty. Because certainty is the fuel of wartime ideology, totalitarian systems require certainty, the way engines require oil. They require a story simple enough to repeat, rigid enough to enforce, and complete enough to swallow doubt. The enemy must be both inferior and dangerous. The leader must be both wise and inevitable. The suffering must be meaningful. In captivity, the women discover that the story was incomplete. Not everything they were told about Americans was wrong. Propaganda is never pure invention. America did have racial tensions. America did have contradictions. America did have people who hated the enemy and expressed it in ugly ways. But the larger framework, the claim that democracy could not organize itself for total war, begins to look like a lie because Camp McCoy is organized. And then the laughter returns. It returns not as a single moment, but as a recurring sound in the camp's daily life. It might come from guards swapping remarks during shift change. It might come from an American clerk at a desk. It might come from a cook in a mess hall. It might come from a GI tossing a comment to another GI as prisoners move past. The women begin to notice something else. American laughter does not always require humiliation. Sometimes it is simply shared between Americans in the presence of prisoners, as if prisoners are part of the environment rather than the object of a ritual of hate. This is deeply destabilizing because hate is a kind of control. If the enemy hates you constantly, you can interpret their actions through that hatred. You can make their behavior predictable. You can steel yourself. You can live inside a story where you are the victim of brutality, and the story gives you meaning. But if the enemy is not constantly consumed by hatred, then something else is happening, something harder to explain. The women begin to understand that America's power might not be only its weapons. It might be its ability to keep society functioning without turning every interaction into a battlefield. That is a kind of abundance that propaganda cannot easily dismiss. In the camp, the women see other evidence of this abundance. Food is a common shock for prisoners in American custody, but in this narration, we keep laughter as the symbolic object and allow food to appear as supporting detail. The women see meals served regularly. They see bread that is not measured in a thin slice. They see coffee. They see cigarettes. They see cigarettes. They see that prisoners can earn wages and spend them at a camp store or canteen. The Army summary of Camp McCoy's history study specifically notes that POWs worked for wages that could be spent at a POW camp store/canteen. Even this detail carries ideological weight. Paying prisoners for work is not simply kindness. It is a concept of law. It is a claim that even enemies occupy a category within a rules-based system. That claim is the opposite of total war ideology, which tends to treat enemies as outside moral consideration. For Japanese women prisoners, raised in wartime Japan's moral climate, this can feel like a trap. Why would the enemy treat prisoners as humans? Why would they pay them? Why would they allow any comforts? One answer is simply that the United States had signed and publicly claimed to follow international conventions governing POW treatment. Another answer is that American policy understood prisoners as a managed labor pool and a security problem, not an object of ritual vengeance. Another answer is that the U.S. had something to prove not only to the world but to itself. In war, nations fight with their ideals as well as their weapons. They weaponize their values. They display them, but for prisoners, the display is not propaganda. It is lived reality. The camp becomes the evidence room. The Japanese women had expected humiliation and revenge. They expected the worst because fear is more survivable than hope. In their imagination, American guards would shout, strike, and reduce them to animals. They expected chaos, cruelty, and a kind of triumphant hatred. What they experienced often was something colder and stranger, procedure. Not always gentle procedure. Not always bare procedure, but procedure nonetheless. They are processed, counted, issued rules, assigned work, observed. The system does not need to improvise cruelty, it has regulations. And then there is laughter, which makes procedure feel even stranger. Because laughter is informal, while procedure is formal. Together, they create a paradox, a system that can be strict without being constantly ferocious. This paradox is hard for prisoners to comprehend, because it undermines the emotional logic of their fear. To understand their shock, we must understand what Japan's wartime ideology had done to the concept of captivity. In Imperial Japan's military culture, surrender was not merely a tactical decision, it was a moral collapse. Soldiers were taught that death was preferable. Captivity was shameful not only for the individual but for the family and the nation. Shame was social and spiritual. It did not end at the prison gate. It followed you in memory, so the women enter captivity with a second fear, layered over the first. Fear of the enemy and fear of what their own society will think of them if they survive. That second fear is internal. It is carried like a hidden wound. In the early days, it is easier for them to hold on to the old beliefs. It is easier to assume Americans are monsters because monsters justify the shame. If the enemy is monstrous, survival is still survival, not collaboration. If the enemy is monstrous, then any kindness is manipulation. But laughter is difficult to interpret as manipulation when it is not directed at them. That is why laughter becomes the recurring symbolic object. It is not supposed to exist in the prisoner's mental model of captivity. It is noise where there should be only threat. As days pass, the women see that the camp's routine continues with the dull persistence of an institution. The guards go on shift. The kitchen serves meals. Clerks process paperwork. Work details move out and return. Medical inspections occur. Letters are handled. Every action becomes part of a clock. This clockwork is itself a kind of psychological warfare, though not always intentionally. It says, the United States is stable. The United States is not improvising. The United States can afford to be systematic. And then, through that system, laughter occasionally passes like a small wind. The women begin to notice another unsettling thing. Americans do not always behave like conquerors. They behave like employees of a machine. They have jobs to do. They have schedules. They complain about the weather. They talk about food. They laugh at jokes that have nothing to do with prisoners. This ordinariness is crushing because it implies that the prisoners are not the center of the world. They are a task. To a mind shaped by militarized ideology, this is humiliating in a different way. In the propaganda world, enemies are always locked in moral struggle. Captivity is supposed to be dramatic. It is supposed to confirm the narrative of righteousness and cruelty. In the American camp, captivity is banal. The drama is replaced by paperwork. And in that banality, the women begin to see their ideology shrinking. Totalitarian ideology makes itself feel vast by filling every space. It makes itself feel eternal by controlling every interaction. It insists that there is no ordinary life outside its reach. But in Wisconsin, behind wire, there is ordinary life. Even for the guards. Sometimes even for the prisoners, in small, bitter forms. And laughter is the sound of ordinary life. At this point, it is necessary to widen the lens beyond the camp fence to show what America was doing in 1945. This is the historical context that makes the camp's atmosphere possible. By late war, the United States had mobilized at an unprecedented scale. Factories produced aircraft, ships, tanks, and ammunition in volumes that shocked even allies. Logistics systems moved men and material across oceans. Training bases across the country turned civilians into soldiers, pilots, and mechanics. Even in remote places, the machinery of war was visible. Trains loaded with supplies, convoys, endless paperwork. Camp McCoy itself was a symbol of this mobilization. It had been a major training and mobilization center, expanded dramatically during the war. It was also a reception and separation center during demobilization. In a Fort McCoy history article, the camp's role in processing large numbers of personnel is described in terms of scale tens of thousands processed in a single month for redeployment and discharge procedures. This matters because it shows why the camp could function the way it did. The POW compound did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader institutional ecosystem. The same installation that could train divisions and process thousands for discharge could also operate a prison camp as another administrative task. The Japanese women prisoners sense this even if they cannot articulate it. They can feel it in the way supplies arrive, in the way schedules are followed, in the way guards seem confident rather than desperate. Desperation makes people cruel. Confidence sometimes makes them controlled. And in 1945, America's confidence was reinforced by the direction of the war. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan's defeat was approaching. The atomic bombs would soon end the war formally, but even before that, the signs were everywhere. American fleets off the coast of Japan. Relentless bombing. The collapse of Japan's ability to protect its cities. In that context, the guards at Camp McCoy were not fighting for survival. They were administering an enemy already beaten. They did not need to prove power through cruelty. The power is already proven by the fact that the prisoners were there. The women, however, were still fighting something inside themselves. The need to make sense of what had happened. The need to reconcile their loyalty, their fear, their shame, and their survival. That reconciliation does not come easily. For many Japanese prisoners, the initial reaction to captivity was despair. In some cases, suicide attempts occurred among captured Japanese troops in the field, reflecting the depth of the stigma around surrender. In American camps, the stigma did not vanish. It sat in the barracks like smoke. For women prisoners, the stigma could be compounded by vulnerability. They feared not only shame, but violation. They had heard stories. They had been taught to expect abuse. They could not easily distinguish rumor from reality because war makes rumor feel safer than hope. So when they encounter a camp that is not immediately violent, the mind does not trust it. It searches for the hidden cruelty. Some of the women interpret the absence of beatings as a prelude to something worse. They expect the cruelty to come later. They brace for it, but day after day, the cruelty does not arrive in the way they anticipated. What arrives is routine. Routine becomes the quiet pressure that reshapes ideology. Because routine is consistent, it cannot be dismissed as a one-time performance. When a guard follows a rule even when he could break it, that is evidence. When a mess hall serves food on schedule, that is evidence. When a prisoner is assigned work and paid wages that can be used at a canteen, that is evidence. When there is no public ritual of humiliation, that is evidence. And when a guard laughs just once, then again later without hatred, without mockery, that is evidence. This is the psychological process the script must capture. The shift from fear-based certainty to complicated reality. The WW2 tale style thrives on this kind of contrast. What people expected versus what they encountered, and how that encounter forced a reevaluation. So we stay close to the women's internal world as they observe. They watch American guards who appear disciplined but not terrified. They see men who carry weapons but whose faces are not permanently hardened into rage. They see guards who sometimes talk casually with each other within earshot of prisoners. They see the strange American habit of speaking as if speech itself is not a controlled re. They see soldiers who can enforce captivity, then step away from it emotionally for a moment, because their identity is not entirely fused to the act of domination. In the Japanese wartime system, identity was fused to service. The individual was expected to disappear into duty. Personal emotion was subordinate to national purpose. Even humor could be suspicious if it suggested detachment. In the American system, the individual soldier is still subject to discipline, but there remains more room for personal expression. The soldier is not expected to become a perfect instrument of ideology. He can complain, he can joke, he can laugh. This difference is not always admirable. Sometimes it can look careless, sometimes it can look disrespectful. But to prisoners who have lived under total mobilization and ideological control, it looks like a kind of freedom. Not freedom of movement, not freedom from wire, but freedom of spirit. And it is that freedom expressed as laughter that threatens the ideological story the women were raised inside, because the propaganda had insisted that democracy was weak, chaotic, undisciplined. Yet here is a democratic army running a POW camp with bureaucracy and order. Here is a democratic society so confident in its structure that its soldiers can laugh in the presence of captives. This is not the behavior of collapse. It is the behavior of stability. Over time, the women begin to see that American abundance is not only material, it is institutional. It is the ability to maintain norms even when dealing with enemies. This is why the story becomes larger than the camp. It becomes a meditation on how systems shape human behavior. In a totalitarian system, fear is a tool of governance. People learn to self-censor. They learn to watch each other. They learn that the state's gaze is always present. Laughter becomes dangerous because it implies independence. In a democracy, fear exists too, and prejudice can be severe. But the system's legitimacy does not depend on everyone maintaining the same emotional posture at all times. There is space for inconsistency, space for ordinary human moments. The women begin to understand this space not as a political theory, but as a lived sensation. It is heard in laughter. They begin to notice that Americans can afford to be imperfect, that the system does not collapse because a guard smiles, that discipline is not maintained solely by fear, but by routine and law. This realization is destabilizing because it suggests that Japan's insistence on absolute emotional control may not have been strength. It may have been a sign of fragility. A system that needs fear to maintain discipline is always afraid of its own people. A system that can maintain discipline while allowing ordinary life to continue is less fragile. These are not academic thoughts for the women. They are quiet impressions formed from repeated observations. And so the transformation begins in increments. A woman who arrives expecting rape and starvation sees instead a nurse's station that treats her fever. She does not feel gratitude. She feels confusion. A woman who arrives expecting beatings sees instead a guard who enforces rules without striking. She does not feel admiration. She feels disorientation. A woman who arrives expecting constant humiliation hears instead laughter. She does not feel comfort. She feels something like betrayal of her own expectations, and that betrayal is painful, because expectations are armor. When the armor is proven unnecessary, you are left exposed. In the camp, the women also confront another reality. Their own side's ideology has been defeated, not only militarily but psychologically. If the enemy does not behave as the propaganda described, then the propaganda itself becomes suspect. If the propaganda is suspect, then the entire moral structure of their wartime sacrifice becomes unstable. This is why totalitarian systems fear exposure to alternative realities, not because people instantly become converts, but because certainty erodes. And once certainty erodes, fear loses some of its power. In the American camp, the erosion is constant. It is in the mail system. It is in the canteen. It is in the regulated work pay. It is in the fact that the camp is built and staffed and maintained like an institution that expects the future to continue. The women begin to realize America is not improvising its war effort, it is executing it. And then laughter becomes the recurring sound that confirms the emotional climate of that execution. Laughter is not always kind. Sometimes it can still be cruel, but the key shock for these prisoners is that it can exist at all, and that it can sometimes exist without cruelty. This suggests that the enemy's identity is not built entirely on hatred. For a prisoner, that is dangerous knowledge. Because hatred is a kind of wall. If the enemy hates you, you can hate them back. You can maintain the moral clarity of war. You can keep the war alive inside your mind even if the guns are silent. But if the enemy sometimes behaves as if war does not require hatred, then the prisoner is forced to confront a more frightening possibility, that the war's moral clarity was partly constructed, and that possibility is the beginning of ideological collapse. Now, the narration must remain factual and careful. We cannot claim specific personal quotes from Japanese women POWs at Camp McCoy about laughing guards unless we have documented SS we have do not provide those quotes directly. So the script must treat the laughter as a plausible and symbolically accurate motif within the wider documented environment of American POW camps while anchoring factual claims to the available S on Camp McCoy's scale in camp life. That is what we do. We describe the atmosphere, the routines, the documented structure, and the psychological contrast. We also place the women within the broader context of Japanese captivity and the late war collapse of Japan without inventing individual identities. The camera of this narration moves like a war photographer, not always close enough to name faces, but close enough to capture expressions. We see the women in a line outside a barracks, their coats pulled tight against Wisconsin's changing weather. We see guards in wool uniforms, rifles slung, cigarette smoke curling into the air. We see a mess hall with long tables. We see a canteen window where script changes hands. We see a clerk stamping forms. We see a posted schedule on a wall. We see a medical inspection line. We see the ritual of counting. And through these images, the laughter returns. Sometimes it is small, almost accidental. A guard makes a remark to another guard about the weather. A cook complains about the volume of meals. A clerk shakes his head at a misfiled form. A brief laugh. The prisoners hear it. For the Japanese women, the sound becomes a reminder of another life they have not lived for years, a life where fear is not the constant background noise. They begin to wonder what it would feel like to laugh without consequences. This is where the narration can allow emotional reflection to rise while remaining grounded, because war does not only kill. It rearranges what feels possible. For these women, laughter begins to represent something larger than humor. It becomes a symbol of psychological freedom, not freedom from captivity, but freedom from constant ideological tension. In Japan, by 1945, many had learned to silence their own laughter, not because they lacked joy, but because joy felt inappropriate amid suffering. And because the state demanded seriousness as proof of loyalty. In America, the guard's laughter suggests that seriousness is not the only acceptable emotional posture. That a soldier can laugh and still be a soldier. That discipline can survive humor. This is a subtle but profound ideological challenge. It suggests that a society can be strong without being emotionally rigid. It suggests that a society can win a war without converting every citizen into a permanent instrument of ideology. This is why the women cannot believe what they are hearing. They had been taught that only a disciplined, honor-bound society could endure. Yet here is America, enduring, winning, and still laughing. Over weeks and months, the women's perceptions shift, not into admiration, but into complexity. Some still hate their captors. Hatred does not disappear because a guard laughs. Some still fear returning home more than they fear captivity. Some still cling to the old ideology because without it they have nothing to explain the loss. But for others, The laughter becomes a sign that something else exists beyond the rigid moral universe of wartime Japan. They begin to realize that fear was used not only to mobilize them, but to control them. They begin to realize that the enemy's strength might not be cruelty, but flexibility. Camp McCoy's history also notes something revealing about the prisoners themselves: disunity and infighting among Axis prisoners, described as a weakness pro-Nazi Germans, bullying non-Nazis, factions, hostility among groups, and refusal to cooperate. The summary emphasizes that there was never a successful escape from the camp. This matters because it shows that captivity did not erase ideology inside the wire. Prisoners carried their conflicts with them. They enforced their own social hierarchies. They policed each other's loyalty. In such an environment, laughter can be dangerous even among prisoners. A wrong expression might be interpreted as collaboration. A smile might be seen as weakness. So when the women hear Americans laughing, they also feel the threat of being seen reacting to it. They learn to keep their faces still. But inside, something changes. They begin to understand that the war has not only been fought on battlefields, it has been fought in the mind through narratives about what is possible and what is permitted. The Japanese state had promised that surrender was worse than death, that captivity would destroy the soul, that the enemy was barbaric, that democracy was chaos. Yet captivity, though painful, does not destroy these women's souls the way the propaganda predicted. Instead, it destroys something else: the absolute certainty of the propaganda. That is the transformation. And in this script, laughter remains the recurring symbol of that transformation. Each time the women hear it, it reminds them that the enemy is not acting as predicted. Each time the ideological wall weakens, not because Americans are saints, but because reality is more complicated than the story. This is an essential point. The script must not become sentimental. It must remain documentary-like, steady, factual. It must acknowledge that American society had its own injustices, and that captivity is still captivity. So we also widen the lens to include the ironies and contradictions. While Japanese POWs were held in camps like McCoy under a regulated system, Japanese Americans and other people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated under different legal frameworks, and their experiences were not the same as POWs. The American home front was not a pure moral landscape. It contained fear, prejudice, and injustice. And yet, even within those contradictions, there existed a culture of ordinary human interaction that could produce laughter. That is the paradox the women cannot reconcile at first, because they were taught that an enemy who defeats you must hate you. They were taught that victory requires cruelty. They were taught that human warmth toward the enemy is weakness. But America's victory is happening anyway, and it is happening in a society where laughter still exists. As 1945 turns into 1946, the camps continue to operate. POW operations at McCoy ceased in 1946, according to the Fort McCoy historical summary. The war has ended officially, yet for prisoners, the end of war is not the end of consequences. They still face repatriation, uncertain futures, and the heavy psychological burden of what they have seen. For Japanese women prisoners, returning home means returning to a society shattered by defeat, occupation, hunger, and shame. It means returning to the ruins of the story they were told. The old ideology cannot hold because reality has broken it. But what replaces it is not immediate freedom. It is confusion. It is the long labor of rebuilding meaning. And that rebuilding small memories matter: a fence line, a mess hall, a clerk's stamp, a canteen window, and a laugh. The women may not speak of it later. They may not even admit to themselves that it mattered. But the sound remains because it was so unexpected. In the epilogue, we return to the first day in the camp when they heard it. The sun is low, the air is cool, the wire hums. Somewhere beyond the compound, the land is quiet. The war is already becoming a chapter in a book for the Americans who will go home and try to forget. For the prisoners, the war is becoming a weight they will carry into a broken future. And in that moment, the laughter is not a symbol of happiness. It is a symbol of a different kind of strength, because freedom is not only the right to vote or the right to speak, it is also the right to be human without fear, human enough to laugh even in the presence of enemies, without the laughter being a weapon or a confession. A totalitarian system cannot easily allow that kind of ordinary humanity. It must keep its people tense. It must keep them obedient through constant seriousness, constant vigilance, constant fear. It must keep laughter contained because laughter implies perspective, and perspective implies independence. In a democracy at war, perspective can survive. It can survive imperfectly, unevenly, but enough that a guard can laugh and still do his job. And for Japanese women prisoners raised inside a world where surrender was the end of dignity, that laughter becomes an unbearable piece of evidence. Evidence that the enemy's power was not only in bombs and ships and factories, it was in a social system confident enough to remain ordinary. In the end, ideologies collapse in many ways. Sometimes they collapse under bombs, sometimes under hunger, sometimes under military defeat, and sometimes, more quietly, they collapse when a prisoner hears an enemy laugh and realizes that fear is not the only way to hold a society together, because the deepest threat to any promise built on total control is the discovery that life outside the promise is wider, and that human beings, ordinary human beings, can still find room to breathe. And sometimes breathing sounds like laughter.